In August, the United States, long the global champion of free markets, took a 10% equity stake in Intel, the icon of American innovation. This wasn't a bailout, it was a strategic act of state intervention, the latest and most aggressive move in a new playbook for American industrial policy. This is the Trump effect in action, a policy where national security and economic leverage are used to rewrite the rules of American capitalism. This move doesn't exist in a vacuum. It follows a pattern of demanding golden shares in the steel industry and forcing revenue-sharing deals with AI chipmakers. The deal signals a fundamental shift in the relationship between Washington and corporate America, raising profound questions about free markets, national security, and the future of state power. To understand this, we need to examine the precedents that set the stage, the crisis at Intel that made it a target, the transactional politics behind the deal itself, and the fierce backlash it has ignited, even from within the president's own party. Let's unpack this. The Intel deal did not emerge from a vacuum. It is the culmination of a clear and escalating pattern of direct state intervention in corporate America, setting two critical precedents in the months prior. The first precedent was set with the acquisition of U.S. steel by Japan's Nippon Steel. Instead of a simple regulatory approval, the Trump administration imposed an unprecedented condition. The U.S. government would receive a golden share in the company. This gave Washington broad authority over corporate governance, a direct lever of state control inside a private enterprise. The intervention then escalated from governance to direct finance. The second precedent was established with AI chipmakers, Nvidia and AMD. The administration engineered a novel arrangement. The companies could resume selling certain AI chips to China, but only in exchange for paying the U.S. government 15% of the revenue from those sales. And the logic of this arrangement wasn't immediately clear. For years, the justification for restricting AI chip sales to China was national security. The new arrangement, however, allowed sales to resume in exchange for a revenue share for the U.S. government. If the chips were a genuine security threat, they shouldn't be sold at any price. If they were not a threat, the government had no basis to impose what was effectively an export tax on a private company's international sales. The move revealed a new transactional calculus, and state revenue seems to be the primary objective here. Critics, including former Vice President Pence, immediately seized on this point. He argued the limitations on the ability of Nvidia to sell chips to China was on the basis of our national security. Simply taking 15% of those sales doesn't serve our national interest or our national security. From taking control to taking a cut of the revenue, this pattern established a new framework for state action. The White House had demonstrated its willingness to assert its interests directly into corporate balance sheets. This made a vulnerable, strategically vital company like Intel the inevitable next target. To understand why the White House intervened, you first have to understand the depth of Intel's crisis. At the start of 2020, the company's market value was more than double Nvidia's. By 2025, Nvidia's was nearly 40 times larger. The company that once defined Moore's Law had fallen years behind its primary manufacturing rival, TSMC. A series of disastrous delays in its process node transitions created a technological gap that crippled the performance of its core products. This manufacturing crisis allowed its longtime rival, AMD, to seize a decisive advantage. By outsourcing its production to TSMC's superior process, AMD delivered a more competitive product, and by 2024 had eclipsed Intel in a critical market, data center chip revenue. This erosion of its core business was compounded by a strategic failure of historical proportions. While Nvidia was building the engine of the AI revolution, Intel was left defending its legacy, effectively missing the most significant technological shift since the Internet. By late 2024, the financial damage was undeniable. In one quarter, Intel reported a historic $16.6 billion loss, announced 16.5 thousand layoffs, and for the first time in decades, canceled its dividend. This collapse transformed Intel from a corporate giant to a national security liability. the multi-billion-dollar CHIPS Act was, in effect, a state-level bet on Intel's ability to create a secure, domestic source for the world's most advanced semiconductors, a critical hedge against the geopolitical vulnerability of Taiwan. Intel's failure, therefore, wasn't just a corporate loss. It represented the potential failure of America's entire strategy to onshore the technological foundation of its economic and military power. In an era defined by a technological Cold War with China, the decline of America's only potential leading-edge manufacturer was no longer a private sector problem. It was a state-level crisis. Intel was now a target, ripe for intervention. The story of Intel's collapse is a powerful example of how a once dominant market leader can become a strategic liability. Analyzing this transition from a corporate asset to a national security problem is the kind of work we do every week in our newsletter, ARPU. If you want to understand how to spot these vulnerabilities before a government is forced to intervene, you'll find the link in the description. The intervention began not with a quiet negotiation, but with a public act of political pressure. On August 7th, President Trump took to Truth Social and called for the immediate resignation of Intel's new CEO, Lip-Bu Tan. The public attack was not random. It was triggered by a letter from Senator Tom Cotton, which questioned Tan's past venture capital ties to China and his role as a responsible steward of American taxpayer dollars. It was a clear signal. The government that was supposed to be Intel's savior was now openly questioning the loyalty of its leader. The arrangement that followed was framed not as a rescue, but as a transaction. It was a conversion of the $11.1 billion in CHIPS Act grants and loans, money Intel was already slated to receive, into a 10% equity stake for the U.S. government. Crucially, the government acquired its shares at a 17.5% discount to the market price. President Trump himself effectively confirmed the transactional nature of the deal, stating that Intel's CEO ended up giving us $10 billion for the United States. This approach was not an isolated incident. It was the blueprint for a new industrial policy. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick later suggested the government was looking at similar arrangements with the defense sector, questioning the economics of companies that benefit from government contracts. The Intel deal wasn't just an intervention, it was a precedent. The deal, intended as a victory for American industry, instead ignited a fierce ideological backlash. For decades, American industrial policy was defined by its contrast to the state-driven capitalism of its global rivals. But in this single move, Washington appeared to be adopting the very playbook it had long condemned. The irony was stark. To compete with its geopolitical rivals, the United States was beginning to act like them. This move triggered an immediate reaction from conservative lawmakers. Kentucky Senator Rand Paul framed it as a direct contradiction of free market doctrine. If socialism is government owning the means of production, wouldn't the government owning part of Intel be a step towards socialism? He posted on social media. North Carolina Senator Tom Tillis drew an even sharper comparison, stating that the arrangement starts feeling like a semi-state-owned enterprise in the Soviet Union. The ideological inversion was given sharp focus when the deal found an unlikely supporter, Senator Bernie Sanders. He praised the move, arguing that American taxpayers have a right to a reasonable return on the subsidies provided to chipmakers. The party of free markets was now championing a policy long practiced by its strategic competitors and praised by its most prominent socialist critic. It was a clear sign that the Trump effect was forcing a collision between long-held economic principles and a new state-driven nationalism. So we return to the central question: why did the United States government take an equity stake in Intel? The answer is a convergence of precedent and crisis, a series of escalating interventions from golden shares in the steel industry to revenue cuts from AI chipmakers, created a new playbook for state action. When Intel, a critical national security asset, faced a corporate and technological collapse, it became the inevitable target for this new interventionist policy. But this deal is more than a one-off rescue. It is a proxy war for the future of American industrial strategy, forcing a direct conflict between two opposing worldviews. On one side is the argument for a new pragmatic nationalism. In this view, the threat from state-driven rivals like China makes free market purism a luxury America can no longer afford. Intervening to save a national champion, ensuring a return for taxpayers, and leveraging state power to win the tech war is not a betrayal of American values, but a necessary adaptation for survival. On the other side is the warning that this is a dangerous step towards state capitalism. Critics from within the president's own party argued this sets a bad precedent, blurring the lines between government and the private sector and risking the very free market dynamism that created Silicon Valley. As former Vice President Penn stated, state-owned enterprise is not the American way. This is the brutal calculus facing Washington. The fight over the soul of Intel is now a fight over the soul of American economic policy. The outcome will determine whether the Trump effect is an anomaly or the new normal for how the state wields its power in the 21st century. Deconstructing these kinds of high-stakes strategic bets is exactly what we do in our newsletter, ARPU. We go beyond the headlines to analyze the second-order consequences of tech's biggest stories. To understand what this new era of industrial policy means for the industry, you can subscribe at the link in the description below. Thanks for watching.